So first things first, who are you, what do you do, and where do you work?
My name is Billy Thompson, and I work for Akamai Cloud Computing, which was formerly Linode, and I am a DevOps and platform engineering specialist on the cloud CTO team, which just means that for any sort of customer engagement that that team touches, if the workload has anything whatsoever to do with DevOps and or platform engineering, then I'm the resource that they bring in.
Sounds good. Now, Kubernetes has many different features, but which one is your least favorite?
Well, the most recent pain point I ran into that was frustrating was issues with getting cert-manager to pass the HTTP validation when you're using proxy mode with the load balancer. And I've had it working before, and it doesn't work all the time. And I spent a good few days really digging deep into troubleshooting this, which was actually great overall because every time that happens, I learn a lot. So there was a lot for me to dig through there, but I would come to find that this problem was not unique to me, and there are many others out there with this same issue, and I find that frustrating that there hasn't been something a little bit more universal as an approach to deal with that, because when we're talking about observability, we're talking about security, and if I want to really watch the traffic in my WAG logs, the proxy mode is, we kind of want that. So that I find really frustrating as of lately, but the good news is I got some really good ideas brewing on how I'm going to work around that. So probably something I can turn into a course or something I'll share on Dev or LinkedIn or something later. So there's always something good to find in the things that hurt.
Now, in terms of the questions we're going to cover today, the first one is around tooling platform engineering. So our guest Angel stressed that standardizing everything makes cluster management easier. What's your advice for building platforms that can be used by several teams in an organization?
So I think first and foremost, can you answer the question of why you need to build the internal platform? As in to say, what part of your toil does it reduce? And is it your toil, or is it someone else's toil from a different company, and it worked great for them to reduce that, and that's the inspiration? Because if it's not actually what's going to resolve the core of some toil that you have, then I would argue it's probably just going to add some more, right? Silos, are those really the problem? And if they are, platform engineering may be one way to address that. It's also worth noting that platform engineering becomes more effective at a certain level of scale. So I've kind of seen a lot of advice in the direction of, oh yeah, this is what you should do. This is best practice. Are you always quite at the scale where you necessarily need to do that? Or is trying to do that too soon on also something that's going to add more toil? So first and foremost, understanding what it is you're trying to solve and really firmly being able to answer the question, is that what we need? Is that going to help us out? So first and foremost. But next, beyond that, let's say you have answered that. It is a good idea. We could benefit from this. It's still likely going to struggle to really be effective if you don't really get the love and adoption from the platform users. These are going to be your SREs, your dev teams, your internal customers for it. And so my advice would really just make sure that they all have a seat at the table. That this isn't just something coming from top down. Here's the new way of doing things. Sorry, you like this way of doing it before, but this is how we're doing it now. This is your new opinionated set of tooling, and so on. Because if they don't love it and they're not embracing it, this may go on for quite some time before you start to see any real benefits from it? And are you spending more time and resources getting this together and trying to get people to use it versus, hey, can I understand what would make your life easier? And can we factor that into our decision on how we're going to build this, what tooling, what it needs, and so on? And I get that every company culture is different, and there's a lot more to this than maybe as simple as I'm making it sound. But that is some sound advice, if I could give any. And then the next thing would be, don't reinvent the wheel. Use things like Kubernetes, right? We have these reconciliation loops and orchestration system that, when you think about it, it does most of the heavy lifting for you. If you look at something in the context of, let me feed it some YAML and it gives me results, something that does the heavy lifting to maintain a desired result, we should just be leveraging open source tooling, things that are platform and cloud agnostic, that are community supported, that are flexible, that are battle tested, that will work wherever we deploy, rather than going too far in the direction of writing our own custom sauce. Now, surely there are scenarios where that makes sense, but consider that every time it's your code or your thing that you wrote from scratch, or every managed service layer that you use on top of this, that's a dependency to a particular vendor that's going to eat into flexibility, that's going to eat into portability, and some of that may be problems downstream, but when you hit those problems downstream, if you can't move, then it's an even bigger problem downstream. So I'm all for the idea of rolling out your own IDP from scratch just for the pure sake of learning purposes. In fact, I love that. I would, if you don't do this already, maybe have a R&D Friday and go through and do that. But for piecing something together, for stitching it together for something you're going to use in production, what is the easiest to maintain? And my best advice is whatever I can use that's both flexible, that's portable, and that makes it so I don't have to work any harder than I already do, really sounds like a good strategy, in my opinion.
Just a quick follow-up question on the subject of silos. We had a podcast guest, Michael Levon, who wrote an article that stirred the pot a bit, saying that he thought silos were a good thing because of the idea that specialization inside a team is helpful, and that's so that someone isn't expected to be a jack of all trades and perhaps get spread too thin. What's your take on that?
I think that's an interesting perspective. I think that when we talk about eliminating silos, there's a lot of kind of dogmatism, I think, to that approach than is more needed necessarily at times. Like, what part of the silos is the problem? This would go back to, kind of my first answers, what are we trying to solve here? So if we look at, say, the origins of DevOps, where there was a problem noted that the friction between folks in the software development life cycle, and those who were maintaining the infrastructure and not having very good continuity, then you can see where it would be difficult to move forward in some cases. So if you have some sort of continuous feedback loop to the point where kind of structurally and culturally, like, well, your problem kind of is also my problem, and my problem is kind of also your problem. So I need some visibility into your world, and you need some visibility into mine, and we can just make this easier for both of us. That doesn't, I think, necessarily mean that we've totally eliminated some degree of silos to the extent that everyone can use everything, and that nobody is specializing in exactly what they do. It's more, what are the barriers that are in the way that are keeping us from doing the things that we're good at doing, and letting those complement each other. So yeah, you'd still specialize in what you do. I think with anything, we just can't be overly dogmatic or, too hyped up about terminology like break the silos or multi-cloud or GitOps everything or anything, or even, good methodologies like test-driven development, or things that you can be overly dogmatic to the point where it causes more actual friction in the time being than, what the goal was to achieve. Does that kind of sit within the question you were asking?
Very much so. Very much so. That's great. So the next question, you did just mention GitOps, but GitOps and infrastructure as code. So one of our guests, Dan Garfield, said that using Kubernetes as a central data store allows tools like Argo to detect and sync drift in your infrastructure. In comparison, tools like Terraform externalize their state and are harder to track. Is the market moving to tools like Crossplane to provision infrastructure and away from Terraform?
I want to say yes and no, because it kind of just depends. So, for all intents and purposes, Terraform can also reconcile drift when we're talking about infrastructure. I think the core of this question is around the automation, or being able to automatically detect and reconcile drift, which, I know Terraform on its own wasn't purpose-built for that, as where Crossplane was. At a certain level of scale, again, absolutely. In the wild, in practice, I've been seeing myself Crossplane really rise to the cause and really take over, especially when you're talking about enormous organizations with geographically diverse teams, and the amount of tooling and managed services in different cloud providers that get stitched together that are used by these various different teams. A little bit of drift there can really cause a ruckus. And so having something that can be a continuous reconciliation loop and facilitate a lot of that for you, rather than relying on really, really large Terraform states, absolutely, 100%. Things are going that way in that context. But what I would also point out is that, at least in my world, it seems like questions like this come up, or best practices around stuff like this come up. They're usually always pointing to a large scale deployment of some sort. We're looking at what Netflix did or what Uber did, or, whoever. And, even at that enterprise level, like even companies with enormous workloads at enormous scale, not everything they're doing is necessarily at that scale and necessarily needs that degree of, in this case, continuous reconciliation. Many, many other workloads and different levels of staging, development, testing, internal products, B2B type stuff, just ETL, routine things that if they can run in some Docker containers and a daily backup strategy and a nightly Terraform state refresh, don't overcomplicate it. And there's also a lot of the SMB and even up to mid-market, a lot of things in startup land, a lot of things that aren't at a scale where maybe they could be doing things in Crossplane, but there's use cases, there's reasons why people aren't. There's organizational boundaries that you have to factor in. The last team that I worked on, due to organizational boundaries, so we were responsible for supporting a product that generates a few million in revenue, a customer-facing product, and due to organizational constraints, it doesn't run in Kubernetes, right? It runs on VMs. And our choice of tooling for that was actually Ansible, because it was the best selection for it. We needed something that was good at provisioning infrastructure, that was also good at configuration management. And Ansible was a great tool for that. It's easy for folks to learn. It was easy for us to maintain. It provided us a way to have consistency across deployments. It can be used to detect and resolve configuration drift. It's a great choice of tooling. That's a scenario where Crossplane wasn't on the table for things to use. And there's plenty other examples like that. So I wouldn't go as far to say that the industry is just moving away from things like Terraform. I'd say that in certain circumstances and particular things at a certain scale that are heavily relying on the automation of Kubernetes as the underlying mechanism, absolutely.
Cattle versus pets, infrastructure as code. Dan Garfield shared that your cluster only feels real once you set up ingress and DNS. Before that, it was just a playground where it didn't matter when stuff broke. What are your thoughts on this?
I guess to me, just an ingress and DNS still isn't quite enough to make it more than a hello world, right? Because you can hit that welcome to Nginx page and it has SSL. That's still, from my point of view, a hello world. I think the point in which it really becomes something serious is when it's more than exploration. When you're using it because you've identified a problem that it can solve for you. So I'm a nerd. I love just doing this stuff in my free time all the time. I love setting things up. I love breaking them and figuring out how to fix them, even on my personal laptop computer. That's why one of the reasons I started using Arch Linux in the first place. I wanted something that would break on me so that I could learn to fix it back when Arch was more difficult to use. But if I'm looking at, for example, okay, I work on a team and it would be useful for us to have something like Keycloak that can deploy just-in-time tokens that we can use for authentication and that we can also use for just our Open Identity Connect to an internal Git repos. And I want to be able to control which Kubernetes resources and namespaces, for example, that different members in different areas of the team have access to, so they have what they need and they have their own dashboards and they have this and that. Okay, now I'm talking about, we have a real use case here. We have something that we actually want to deploy and use internally, use productions to help us succeed at what we're doing. Identifying some choking points and some things that we're running into, some things that are not going as smoothly that I think this would be a solution to. And so now I'm taking my kind of toy of a cluster with my ingress and my welcome to Nginx page. And now I'm looking at adding like Git and I'm looking at adding Argo and I'm looking at adding Keycloak and I'm looking at actually really turning this cluster into something that we can use for a real case scenario. And then it gets serious. And then it is, I wouldn't say not fun to troubleshoot, but less fun when the troubleshooting is not going well.
Now, you've in terms of, I talk to a lot of people and do a lot of interviews. You've obviously thought about a lot of these things and you express yourself in a very thoughtful way. Who are the people in the ecosystem who you look up to the most?
So I think the person who inspired my particular style of troubleshooting was somebody that I actually, up until very recently, was still working with, but we worked together for a while, just the two of us, when I was working in professional services. And as this person, Elvis Segura, and so his troubleshooting methodology and the way he divides the problem in half and then in half again and then in half again and then in half again, that was what inspired me to want to find joy in troubleshooting and to put me in a situation where I can thrive in chaos and where, to a fault sometimes, I actually enjoy that, and to where I enjoy certain levels of complexity, like Kubernetes, for example. I talk about how difficult the learning curve could be because for a lot of people it is, and I guess, you could say that I had to jump in the shark tank to learn to swim there too. But did I feel like it was hard to learn? I'm sure, all things considered, it was, but it didn't feel that way because I was thirsty for it. I was excited for it. I like the challenge. It's exhilarating to me. And that energy is really something I got from my former colleague, Elvis. And then I also had a former manager who's just mountains me in experience. But what was interesting is, so for his take and his level of seniority, the amount of time he would spend picking my brain on a particular idea or issue because of how forward he was about, it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, how good you are at whatever, there is always something you can even learn from a junior engineer. There's always a different perspective. So that's something that's kind of really resonated to me, and an attribute that I sort of look up to. In terms of resources, the best conversations and where I ultimately think I get the most exposure is going to be with customers, actually, especially when things aren't going super well, and at conferences. You know, like I really try to keep my ear to the ground and look for inspiration about new things I want to try and what's going on, and these cool stories about how this person solved this problem and that problem. I really try to get that out of podcasts, but my ADHD just makes that difficult for me a lot of the time. But I travel and go to a lot of conferences, and the engagement, the one-on-one conversations that I have with people there, everything from technical co-founders, CTOs, and product managers, and you name it. And a lot of the conversation is typically, I have a problem that I'm curious your thoughts on how you think, you know, to go about this, and we did this and we did this. Or it's more, they're really proud about some problem they solved and they want to tell somebody about it. And I get a lot out of that. So if you're able to either get your company to help sponsor you for conferences, if you can submit proposals to do talks about things that you're passionate about and try to get funding that way, if you can try to get student or learner discounts, just those are great atmospheres along with meetups. And then other than that, I find myself that website dev.to, I just think is a lot better in terms of technical content for people like me, because I see a lot of posts on there that are people at earlier stages in their career that just got really excited about something new that they just picked up on, they just learned how to do, let's say on Kubernetes, and then they go and write about it with all the excitement. And so it's cool that that environment fosters that, but then there's also more advanced material mixed in there, and then some stuff that just sort of cross-pollinates. And one thing to consider with that is, no matter how far you go with something, like let's say, you know, you're a master pro at Kubernetes, and you know the stuff you're doing with it just topples people, right? But then if you have to get familiar with something, say like a distributed message queue, if you're looking at Kafka from the ground up, or you're looking at data engineering, it's not like you just jump into a 400 level course and keep going. Like, no, you want to go back to the basics like everyone else and have something that's clear, that just gets you the fundamental concepts so you understand and move from there. And at least for me, it would be frustrating to just jump right into something new at a further advanced state, level 3 or 400, when I'm just starting out. So dev.to is a place where I just feel like it's rich with those types of articles and everyone sharing. I think it's a great resource. And I'm actually surprised at how many of us in this industry don't know about it. I bring it up a lot, and people talk about Medium, they talk about LinkedIn, and I bring this up. And so if you haven't checked it out, check it out. Get a profile, write stuff. We enjoy it. I enjoy it.
I have to say, we've been, we've done 4 seasons of our podcast. It's a question that we ask just about everybody about in terms of resources. And if this is maximum the second time this has ever been mentioned, and it could be the only time it's been mentioned. People, as you said, will refer to Medium. People will talk about Reddit. People will talk about Hacker News. We'll talk about a lot of other places. But dev.to is not. It's one that I've definitely seen. But in terms of interviewing people, we've interviewed a ton of people. It hasn't come up yet. So I think that's very useful. Billy, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
I'd say best way to get in touch with me is honestly just LinkedIn. in terms of what I check the most often. And I'm always happy to get feedback or ideas, or if I said something that you really disagree with and you really want to tell me why, I love it. So please do. If you're interested, reach out to me. Also, as I mentioned, I do travel to a lot of conferences. I'm on the road a lot. There's a lot of ways to meet me in person in a lot of different cities in the US, in Europe, less the APJ region, but I've been starting to make my way out there more. And so anytime there's an opportunity to meet me in person, I usually try to post something about it before I go there. Haven't always been the best about that, but continuous improvement.
Perfect. Billy, thank you very much for your time today. I look forward to seeing you in the future.
Right on. Thank you.